everyone and welcome. My name's Beth Sennett and I'd like to speak to you today about the transformative pedagogy of Paulo Freire and how his work can be used to support students to engage in much more critical understanding of the world, and how that can then lead to them being engaged in transforming their world. So the presentation today is going to be divided into four key areas. We're going to start by thinking about education as conformity. Now this relates to how Freire views education as a means to often maintain the status quo. We're then going to think about education as freedom, so how education can also be used to transform the situation. And then we're going to take a slightly deeper dive into Freire's pedagogical approach itself. And then finally, I'm going to show you how his approach can be applied to three separate situations and three separate student groups in order to support that transformation. So I'd like to start with a quote from Paulo Freire, where he says that there is no such thing as neutral education. Education either functions as an instrument to bring about conformity or freedom. So let's start by thinking about this idea of education as conformity. So those of us who work in higher education are probably quite used to hearing terms like graduation numbers, maximising productivity, employability, customer satisfaction. And these are all things that a lot of critical educators, such as Henri Giroux, for example, are often criticising and questioning, because it basically starts to turn education into a form of training. Now, Freire talks about this when he says that all that really matters is solely technical training, the standardisation of content and the transfer of well-behaved knowledge of results. So what's the problem, though, with that form of education? Well, Margaret Ledwith actually talks about how this traditional form of education often plays a very hegemonic role in maintaining the interest of the privileged in society. So education becomes a means to train the workers to work and to train those who are more privileged to lead. And as Freire says, it tends to then simply reproduce social power. Now, one of the problems with this is when we start to think about how culture can be used as a means to create new ideals, but also to condition its creator, as Freire says. What this means is that we don't often question the education system when we see it in this way. It becomes very, very normal, and we fail to start to question whether education has simply become a means to train workers to work and to maintain the power of the elite and maintain the status quo. So how do we change and transform that? Well, the late great Bell Hooks says that when we move education beyond boundaries, education then becomes the practice of freedom. So as well as being potentially oppressive, education can be a means for liberation. Now, Freire understands this in the sense that he recognises that even though education can be oppressive and can be served to oppress certain social groups, because education system works in a dialectical relationship with us as educators and with our students, it gives us the power to, as teachers and educators, to actually disrupt that process and to use this process of educating to try and transform the situation and transform the system. Now, this is highlighted very much in how Freire views and understands the use of power. So rather than Freire seeing power as something that simply sort of comes from above and oppresses particular groups, he also recognises that power can work through people. So power can be utilised by the oppressed in order to initiate change. So let's move on to start thinking about Freire's pedagogical approach and how he sees education as a means to do this. So one of the key and fundamental aspects of Freire's pedagogy is he believes that it has to be those who are in oppressed situations who must lead. And he says those who recognise or begin to recognise themselves as oppressed must be among the developers of the pedagogy. And I'd say that this is one of the key factors. We cannot, as educators, be looking for a transformative approach whilst still teaching in a quite an authoritative way. So assuming that we know best and we must lead this fight. It has to be done as a co-creation with our students. So these are how I have interpreted Freire's key tenets of transformative pedagogy. Now, I think it's important to say at this point that Freire, throughout his life, was very adamant that he would never create a how-to guide of how to do his work, primarily because he always says that every approach, every way of applying his work needs to be in collaboration with our students and within the context in which we are working. Therefore, any approach is going to be unique. Freire is also adamant that anybody who reads and applies his work needs to do so by engaging dialectically with his work. So therefore, I don't think he'd be very happy if I sat here and gave you a kind of how-to guide. But so I want to present this as simply my interpretation, would very much encourage everyone to explore Freire's work themselves and to really try to get to grips with their interpretation of his work. So this is how I have interpreted Freire's pedagogy. So the first principle or philosophical ideal is that we need to encourage students to connect with the wider world. Now, what Freire means by this is that all of us have a tendency of viewing the world in our own little bubble. We all tend to view the world based on our own experiences, our own ideas, our own life experiences, and it can sometimes be difficult to then recognise how things might be impacting other people or to see beyond that. So we very much need to encourage students to widen that bubble, to start to see the world as it is in its much more complete form. So that's one of the key things that Freire argues. We need to support our students to do that. Freire also argues that we need to challenge this idea of the teacher and student relationship, and in particular challenge the power that often exists within that, so that our students become teachers and educators. But probably more importantly, and often quite more challenging, is the idea that as teachers and educators, we need to be prepared to be students, and that needs to be genuine. So we cannot say, yes, I listen to my students, I respond to what they say. We actually need to be prepared to allow our students to change our understanding of something and our perceptions. And this can be quite a challenging thing to do, and particularly if we are sort of experts in our field and we consider that we know something quite well. When a student says something different, often our first reaction is, oh, they're not really understanding that properly. But actually we need to be very careful about that and make sure that we are engaged in questioning and a dialectical conversation with our students to ensure that we do allow ourselves to also be taught and also be the student. The third point here is probably one of the most famous aspects of Freire's work, where he challenges what he views as the banking system of education, which is when we are simply depositing ideals in students' heads. And he says instead we need to engage in a problem-posing education where we're encouraging our students to question. Now, we do this through critical dialogue, engaging our students in critical dialogue and conversation with each other, with other people, and with the objective world as well. And through doing that, we can start to unveil and then challenge oppression that exists in our society. Now, the final tenet is often a slightly more controversial idea that Freire puts forward. It's the ideal of conscientization. And Freire argues that this is basically the ideal of, as the image suggests, that light bulb moment. It's the moment when you start to see the world differently and you really start to understand the way the world works. And that's what we want our students to develop. Now, conscientization is an ongoing process. So it's not something that we ever achieve. It is the idea that we recognize the need to consistently reflect and critically engage and question the world around us. So Freire argues that when we encourage students to work in this way, that then when they start to see the world differently, it makes them want to take action to change things, to make things better. And that's where we get them starting to engage in the action part of Freire's work. So just to explain a little bit more about this idea of conscientization, Freire sums this process really, really nicely when he says, that in order for the oppressed to be able to wage the struggle for their liberation, they must perceive the reality of oppression not as a closed world from which there is no exit, but as a limiting situation which they can transform. So as I said, the purpose of this presentation is I'd like to show you different ways in which Freire's pedagogy can be applied to different situations. But what's really important about this is that when any of us want to try and engage in this, as Freire says, we must strive to recreate and also rethink his thinking. We cannot just be applying his work without sort of questioning what he's saying. And he points out as well that no education takes place in a vacuum. So the ways that I've interpreted Freire's pedagogy, the ways that others will interpret it, will depend on the situation you are in and the students you are working with. And I think that's a really important aspect here to take home today. Okay, so let's give some examples of when Freire's pedagogy has been applied to work with students. So I'd like to start by introducing a student group that was started at a UK university with dyslexic students. And the group was part of a wider research project, which I'll talk about in a moment. But just to let you know that the students themselves chose the term Dyslexics Untie, and that's how they named the group. It was a bit of a joke on the terms Dyslexic Unite, but obviously Untie spelled it's an interpretation of unite. So the aim of the group was to support dyslexic students in higher education to start to question and challenge the norms of education, so that they move from what is often a deficit approach of their dyslexia to actually understanding it in a much more broader way. And this came about primarily because of the work that I used to do working as a dyslexia tutor, and also the fact that I'm dyslexic and neurodivergent myself. So seeing what my students were experiencing and seeing my own experiences, I wanted to try and find a way to encourage students to really question their situation. So, in questioning the deficit model, as Freire points out, a lot of the time we see these tokenistic policies will come into place in society that present the oppressed as problems to be solved. And as Freire says, it insists on the suggestion that the great big problem with the oppressed lies in the deficits of nature or the deficiencies of nature. The latter, on the other hand, so the latter being a more positive approach to education, underscores the importance of the social, economic, political, and in some power. So the way that we engage students in this, as I mentioned, this was part of a wider research project. So in order to demonstrate the transformative impact of this work, we conducted, first of all, interviews with the students before they engaged in the workshops. We then engaged in a series of discussion groups where we encouraged students to question and challenge ideas around dyslexia. And you can see around the outside of this visual, these are ways that we started discussions. So sometimes we started with a quote to see what might encourage conversations. Sometimes we started with an image. You can see up on the top right-hand corner there, there's a cartoon which actually represents an experience I had when I was working as a primary school teacher, when I overheard a colleague try to say that I wasn't dyslexic because I was sat reading. So we used a lot of these ideas of ways to spark conversations. And then after the discussion groups, which went on for a good semester, we then engaged the students in carrying out some sort of action, some sort of project they wanted to do. And in this case, the students decided they wanted to run a particular evening to raise awareness of dyslexia. And then we engaged in a second lot of interviews to support the students to reflect upon their ideas around dyslexia afterwards. So let me show you some examples of how this engaged in transformation. So the first example I'd like to give you, now this is a story that was told by one of the participants called Cami. These are different names, by the way. And Cami, in the first interview, described this entire narrative around all the times throughout her education that she had tried to get support for her dyslexia, from primary school through to secondary, through to A-levels and college. And each time she was completely fobbed off by her teachers, who would say things like, oh, well, there's no point really now because, you're going to move into secondary school and they'll be able to get you an assessment. Or, oh, well, there's really no point doing it because you haven't got any written exams. So, so she was consistently kind of fobbed off and really just took this as being fact, as this is the way it is. Okay, let's move on. When I encouraged her to think back to that situation in the final interviews, this was her response. She said, talking about teachers, they need to educate themselves more. Now, I thought this showed a really lovely kind of change and transference from teachers who hold all the power, who are the experts, to actually teachers need to be questioning themselves as well. So this is another example around the ideas of education by a participant called Jean, who at the beginning, before we engaged in the workshops, was talking about her dyslexia and her struggles in education and very much describing things that were, as she puts it there, that there was something in my brain, something wasn't right, I was the one who was struggling. And then in the final interviews, she goes on to say, there's other ways to educate and the school is just one of them. And I think, again, that shows quite a significant shift from thinking about a deficit model to actually recognising that education is more than just sitting in a school and being told information. Similarly, we've got Andy here, who was talking about exams. And in the first interview, Andy was saying, you sort of start to question yourself. When he received grades that he wasn't expecting that were a lot lower than he was expecting. So again, blaming himself for that. And then in the final interview, he has this much broader narrative around education when he says, although I may leave education in 2 weeks' time, I'm still going to be inspired to learn new things and I want to do new things and have those skills and progress. So education, it's so short and it's your learning impact and then it's grades. So again, a very different sort of narrative that he's putting forward there. Equally, this was Andy also talking about literacy. And again, in the first interview, you can see a very deficit understanding of literacy. This is my key weakness. It's phonics, it's grammar, it's punctuation. My spelling is also weak. Then in the final interviews, he's really starting to question the ideal of literacy when he says, we write essays for a really pompous reason, really. It's all pretty much a tick in the box. It's a checklist of this student's matching the level of potential. It's the only way we can present and show, I think, to the best of our abilities. A test of time, of knowledge, a test of our understanding. And also it's just there as evidence of what you've done. So why is this a first-class degree? So he's really, again, starting to question this ideal of education. And this links quite strongly to Freire's ideal of conscientization, where students start to question their social reality. This is another student called Katharina who was talking about her exams. And again, in the initial interview, she was saying, my grades weren't as good as other people's. And I'd put in so much effort. And some of my friends wouldn't revise and then they'd still come out with C's or B's. And, that I'd come out with C's and B's and then they'd get an A. Now, any of us who are dyslexic or any of us who have worked with dyslexic students will find this a very familiar story when people with dyslexia invariably have to put in so much more effort, double, triple the effort of neurotypical students, and often come out with lower grades within our current education system. So after having these workshops and after having more of a conversation, Katharina stated afterwards, when she was talking about exams, she said, I don't know what that's teaching. They're not testing your literacy, they're testing your memory, aren't they? So what's the point in that? Literally, what is the point? It's got a bit silly, hasn't it? So again, she's starting to problematize this idea of examinations. Why do we have them? What are they actually showing? So on the final slide here, I'd like just to show you some of the other forms of transformation that this group actually engaged in. Now, these are just some quotes that I've taken from the students in the final and analysis of interviews. So Debbie here talks about how she was going to be more confident in the workplace now than she was before university, and partly because of the project and the conversations we've had. Debbie also makes a wonderful suggestion when she says she wants to get a box of coloured overlays that can go in the library. This was another really nice way that the group started to transform the wider university. So after the research project, they started liaising with the library at the university, and the library staff were incredible and really started to work with the students to create a much more dyslexic friendly space in the library. We've got a quote from Andy here at the bottom where he talks about how all the transformative work they've been doing, he says it's like a stepping stone and laying the foundation to push on forward for something else. Again, really kind of inspiring statements there. And then similarly, Jean's saying here, because doing the Dyslexic Untied, the meetings before that and meeting new people, it increases my knowledge of dyslexia, my knowledge of how it is responded to by other people, which then in turn would impact how I see it in another person. And then this links back to what we were talking about with the widening of that bubble, really sort of expanding students' understanding of their situation. So I just want to briefly talk about two other occasions where I've applied Paulo Freire's work. We're working with students. So this particular group was a More for Education group. The students again named the group, and it was a group where we talked about all forms of education. It was open to all students, so not just dyslexic students in this case. The project was purely to kind of transform students' understanding of what education is. Now, as Bart Hook says, to educate for freedom, then, we have to challenge the way that everyone thinks about pedagogical process, and this is especially true of students. So this was one of the key reasons why we wanted to run this group. So you can see here some of the transformative ideas. Now, these are going to be much more kind of generalized because it wasn't a research project, so I didn't feel comfortable providing students comments specifically, but just as a general understanding, one of the key things that came out of the group is that the group started talking about this idea as education is training. And again, this links back very strongly to people like Henri Giroux was saying, and this just came purely from the conversations and the discussions that we were having. Equally, the students themselves started to want to plan and lead the sessions, which was fantastic. And two members of the group went on to train to be teachers, so bringing these ideas into education as well. The third group I want to talk to you about is the group called Breaking Through. Now, this is a group that was developed by myself and a wonderful colleague of mine called Nikki Northern in response to the fact that we were often hearing how our students were experiencing a lot of racism and racist comments throughout their time at university. And sadly, we were also hearing how sometimes members within the university were not responding in a very positive way, and in actual fact were almost kind of, again, blaming the students themselves for what was happening. And we wanted to create a space where students could start interrogating the structures that often normalize racism. So Hooks again comments on how students who enter the academy unwilling to accept without question the assumptions and values held by privileged classes tend to be silenced or deemed troublemakers. And this was something that we were really seeing with our students and how they were spoken to in regards to when they were trying to challenge racism. So again, the group was set up in a very similar way. We started having conversations with students and engaging them in discussions around race and racism. And here you can see some of the stimuli that we used in order to start these conversations. So this particular example is a newspaper article from The Guardian, which we used to start conversations around the idea of performative allyship. And this led to the students starting to question some of the initiatives that had been started by the universities and whether they were performing that role. We also had used quotes and things, for example, this one from Freire, and equally we used, in this case, this is a clip from Black Panther, which we used to engage students in conversations around museums and Black history. And again, the transformative impact of this was that a lot of our students gave us feedback that they loved the community support here. They loved being able to have that space to talk about their experiences. And we very much wanted to keep this space open to students of colour and also white students. Myself as a white woman and my colleague Nikki Northern as a black woman, we wanted to show that representation so that these conversations could be had together. It was also really important that we started kind of questioning the ideas of tokenistic approaches to anti-racist work that a lot of educational institutes tend to establish. And also, one of the really nice things that came from the group was that two members of the group actually started to join institutional anti-racist work. So they started to have an impact on the wider university and bringing these conversations and dialogue to the wider university. So, just to finish, I just wanted to conclude by just talking about, again, reiterating the idea that Freire's pedagogical approach can be applied in so many different situations. It could be applied within modules, it can be applied within working with student groups, it could be applied by professional services who work with student groups. And one of the really nice things about Freire's transformative pedagogy is, as Freire says here, it transcends beyond the university. And he says this act of convincing that you carry out as a pedagogical task in the university transcends the walls of the university. When you work towards convincing the students, your effort is in relation to a political victory that takes place outside of the university. And this is something that we've seen repeatedly. I've been very privileged to stay in touch with some of our students, and many of those who are now in the workplace have talked about how these conversations, these discussions have empowered them to have conversations with their line managers, with SMT within their current workplaces. So this ideal, once students start to recognise they can change and they can transform the world around them, it really does continue beyond the university. Thank you very much for listening. I'd just like to show you the contents here as well. So if you'd like to look at any of the references, thank you very much, everyone.